In the previous session, we looked at similarities of meaning of various sorts. We saw that there were synonyms, expressions with more or less the same meaning, and lexemes that were polysemous, where the meanings of the word were not quite identical but certainly related. And we also looked at similarities of form, where there is no similarity of meaning in the case of homonyms. We now turn to things that are opposite in their senses, in their meanings. These aren't all the same either. There are a number of them, and we're going to start with the most interesting, antonyms. Antonyms are words that have fascinated linguists for a while. Edward Sapir, who was one of the great linguists of the 20th century, enjoyed antonyms. He thought that they were interesting. They're at opposite ends of a scale. For example, fast and slow. And if you think about it, you can probably think of half a dozen at least other antonym pairs. Tall and short. High and low. Fat and thin, and so forth. You'll notice that each of them has a scale. The fast and slow scale is a speed scale, and the tall and short is a height scale. Hot and cold is a temperature scale. So these antonyms are at opposite ends of the scale. They are also gradable. Faster, slower, fastest, slowest. So they're adjectives. They're gradable adjectives. They're gradable in a variety of ways. You could say very fast, moderately fast, very slow, terribly slow. They're gradable. You'll notice that their senses are kind of fuzzy. How fast do you have to be fast? Well, it depends. If you're walking, then fast is, maybe 3 kilometers an hour. If you're running, you're a lot faster. But if you're driving a car, then really 20 kilometers an hour is very slow. So these senses are applicable to a wide range of situations, and their exact boundaries are not clear. Somewhere along the temperature scale, fast stops, and a little further down, slow starts. But exactly where their extremities are, just how fast fast is and how slow slow is, isn't exactly clear. And as we'll find later, that makes them very useful. Just the fact that they're imprecise. They also have another interesting characteristic. A number of pairs have a situation where one of the pair, in some situations, represents the whole scale. For example, if you meet someone and you say, "How old is your baby?" and the person says, 2 months, you don't say, "That's ridiculous, 2 months isn't old." So, old actually has two meanings. It has the meaning old, like old compared with young, but it also means old, namely the whole of the age scale. What about entailment and antonyms? We looked at entailments last time for synonyms and showed that the entailment works both ways. Okay, if something is fast, then it follows that it is not slow. A fast car is not a slow car. What about a slow car? Well, it's not a fast car. Right, so we have again a reversible entailment, this time with a negative in front of it. Something which is not fast, however, is not slow. And something which is not slow is not necessarily fast. Because in between fast and slow, there's something in the middle. So, something which is fast is not slow, something which is not slow is not fast. Work these out for yourself. They're really quite interesting because you can follow the entailments exactly. They're not actually very confusing. And it's a perfect test for antonyms that if something is fast, then it is not slow. That's how those pairs work. Here's another kind of oppositeness, rather different this time. These are mutually exclusive senses. If something is one, then it can't be the other, and there's nothing in between. Let's look at boy and girl. If someone is a boy, then it follows that they are not a girl. And if they're a girl, it follows that they're not a boy. That's pretty much the same as antonyms, but there's nothing in between. If we're talking about young people, then if someone is not a boy, then they must be a girl, and if they're not a girl, then they must be a boy. So we have those negatives working both ways. Sometimes there are situations where these mutually exclusive senses are more than just pairs. We know from doing science that a substance is either a solid or a liquid or a gas, and there's nothing else. That's it. They're not gradable, of course. Something can't be very liquid, really, or very gas. These are not matters of degree. It's either one or the other. So how does the entailment work? Well, we've just done that, haven't we? If there are three of them, if something is not a gas and not a liquid, then it follows that it must be a solid. So complementaries also have entailments. And the last form of negative we can look at are converses. They're different ways of looking pretty much at the same thing, so they're not sort of opposite really, although they're sometimes lumped in with oppositeness. Let's have a look at husband and wife. This is really quite different from boy and girl. We're talking here about a matrimonial relationship, and looked at from one side it has to do with being the wife, and looked at from the other side it has to do with being the husband. And if we are talking about matrimonial relationships, then if you're not the wife, then you must be the husband, and vice versa, certainly in the kind of Western societies that we're used to, where there are no large harems. The same thing happens with buy and sell. Buy and sell, of course, are verbs, and husband and wife are nouns. Here the situation's more complicated. If Mr. X buys a product Y from Miss Z, then Miss Z sells the product to Mr. X. Buying and selling are just different ways of looking at essentially the same kinds of transaction. So these are often called converses. What happens with entailment and converses? Well, if X sold something to Y, then Y bought X from. So there are entailments there. If X is the husband in the family or the relationship, then and the husband of Y, then Y is the wife of X.